Who was the man by Washington's side during the entirety of the Revolution that changed the class-conscious commander-in-chief's opinions and attitudes about slavery? His actions and example in Washington's service helped to open the door for policy changes that led to African-American conscription during the War for Independence and the freedom of over 5,000 black men by war's end. The Truth About Colonial Linden Extra presents William Lee.
Billy Lee was born in 1750.
William and his brother Frank joined the Washington household at Mount Vernon in 1768. The young men were described as mulatto, meaning their mother was a slave on the Lee plantation and their father was an unidentified white man. This common occurrence could have been from the master taking liberties, however, this was not always the case. Lower-class sharecroppers also worked the lands alongside their enslaved neighbors, and as the children would become property of the plantation owner, not free sons of the sharecropper, there wasn't backlash for relationships by generally Scotch-Irish men and African descent women. Simply, it was free money to the plantation. So there is no documentation of whether these brothers were consensual or coerced pregnancies. William, or Billy as he was known to the general, was athletic in his youth and regarded as an expert equestrian. Sharing similar abilities to General Washington, William was a welcome inclusion among the men of Washington's fox hunts, unusual during this time to say the least. Will the huntsman rode a steed named Chickling, recorded to be much like his rider Billy, and the two were known to rush at full gallop through wood and brake alike. It was said so professionally that fellows on the hunt would be amazed, and it is thought by scholars that a modern huntsman may stand aghast at Lee's abilities. Washington was always mindful of protocol within the gentry. Though the general's actions would dictate a genuine affinity for a man that he had purchased, when reading the recorded language in which Washington used in referring to Mr. Lee would often seem quite cold. When referring to a slave or lower class for that matter, Washington always held up the protocol of sharp distinction. Nevertheless, it stands apparent in Washington's writings during the Revolution that Lee and Washington's relationship evolved. Washington's opinion about the slave class in regards to the cause, duty, and the rights of man. During the 8-year conflict, Lee continued as Washington's valet and was always near in battle and camp alike. From its onset in Massachusetts to Washington's greatest glory at Yorktown, Lee had been through it all. Billy Lee rode with him to the field, quick to hand a sword or an eyeglass. Lee, a slave and not a soldier, did have occasions of combat. We do not know if such an occasion happened early before the first African or Afro descendants were conscripted, possibly a factor in Washington changing his mind about black conscripts. We do know that he was amid the fray at Monmouth and Trenton, fighting alongside the commander-in-chief. For educational purposes, we're going to include a piece put out by Mount Vernon in which a description of William Lee and his duties at Mount Vernon before and after the War for Independence, including his time at the end of his life as a freeman where he worked as the Mount Vernon cobbler.
For 2 decades, William Lee accompanied George Washington nearly everywhere. As his enslaved manservant or valet, Lee assisted his master with many tasks, from delivering messages to laying out of clothes to tying a silk ribbon around his hair. Washington's step-grandson described Lee as muscular, athletic, and an excellent horseman. According to Washington's financial papers, William Lee arrived at Mount Vernon in 1768. Washington purchased him from Mary Lee, a wealthy Virginia widow, for £61, 15 pence sterling. Lee was described as mulatto, or mixed race, meaning he was probably the son of an enslaved mother and a white father. Lee served with Washington throughout the Revolutionary War. He was responsible for organizing the general's personal affairs, including his voluminous papers. As the attendant to a prominent figure, Lee became a minor celebrity. In a recollection of Washington, visitors at Mount Vernon occasionally sought out the famed body servant of the commander-in-chief. Spending more than 7 years together during the intensity of war seems to have made Washington and Lee's relationship especially close. Washington's views on slavery shifted significantly during the war. He emerged with a newfound abhorrence of slavery and a commitment to neither buy nor sell slaves to avoid separating the enslaved families. Washington noted in his diaries that in the mid-1780s, Lee endured several accidents that severely damaged both of his knees. Lee insisted that he was well enough to continue as Washington's valet. However, it soon became clear that he was no longer able to do so. Lee was reassigned to work as Mount Vernon's shoemaker. It is unclear and perhaps impossible to know whether Lee's devotion to Washington stemmed from a genuine affection or the desire to maintain a position of relative privilege within the enslaved community. Washington certainly believed the former. When Washington died, William Lee was the only slave freed immediately in his will. Washington provided Lee with an annual allowance of $30 for the rest of his life, noting, "This I give him as a testimony of my sense of his attachment to me and for his faithful services during the Revolutionary War." According to 19th century sources, William Lee remained on the estate until his own death in 1810 and is believed to be buried in the enslaved cemetery at Mount Vernon. To learn more about the lives of the enslaved community at Mount Vernon, you can visit mountvernon.org/slavery.
Billy Lee met his wife Margaret Thomas in Philadelphia during the war. She was a freed African American and worked as a servant at Washington's headquarters. The couple had 3 children, Sinai Lee, Rose Lee, and Joanna Lee. In 1784, the couple requested Washington to allow Margaret and the children to move to Mount Vernon. This despite black marriages not being recognized by Virginia law. Washington reluctantly complied, explaining how could he deny this to someone so faithful in his duty during the war. Unfortunately, it seems Margaret passed away before reaching Virginia, according to one source. The other sources state it wasn't known if she had passed just after reaching Mount Vernon. The next year, the agile William suffered another devastation, severely injuring his knee while on expedition with Washington. This eventually caused him to be unable to continue his lifelong duties. William did try to continue traveling with the general. On his trip to NYC for Washington's inauguration as the nation's first president of the Constitution, Billy Lee's trip was unfortunately stalled in Philadelphia, where he was forced to remain behind for medical treatment. At the conclusion of his treatment, doctors fitted him with a steel brace, which enabled Lee to rejoin the president's household for a time. Washington retired in 1797, and Lee, 47 at the time, could not perform his previous duties at Mount Vernon. This prompted him to begin serving as the cobbler for the estate, a position he would continue after he was freed in 1799 for the rest of his life. The hardships William faced in the second half of his life did unfortunately lead to marginal alcoholism, according to some sources. But it's also noted that many Revolutionary War veterans passing Mount Vernon would stop in and reminisce over the war with Lee, who had been involved in so many of the crucial happenings during the conflict. He died in 1828 at the age of 78 years old and was buried at Mount Vernon.